Investigators in Indonesia have released their final report into what caused last year's Lion Air disaster. According to the findings, design and mechanical problems were responsible for the 737 MAX crash, which killed 189 people. Indonesia correspondent Anne Barker reports.
The last year has brought great joy and unbearable grief for Anton Sahadi. His first child was born a few months after the Lion Air crash killed two of his close cousins. Both relatives were flying home after a weekend in Jakarta when the plane plunged into the sea. Anton Sahadi and his uncle still struggle to make sense of the crash.
We just want to know what caused it and who's responsible.
Now, a year since the tragedy, the final crash report confirms there were flaws in the MAX 8's design, compounded by flight crew failures. Most of the blame is on Boeing for introducing an anti-stall system known as MCAS without giving pilots proper instructions on how to override the software when it malfunctions, which it did. Reliance on a single sensor measuring the angle of flight made the system more vulnerable. On the day of the crash, it sent faulty data that wrongly triggered the automated system, which immediately forced the plane's nose down, causing it to dive into the sea. But Lion Air also comes in for criticism. Similar malfunctions on earlier flights weren't properly repaired, and a faulty sensor was replaced but wrongly calibrated. Victims' families are angry the report doesn't attribute direct blame or sanction Lion Air.
We don't accept the findings. They don't explain who should be held responsible or be punished, not even the airline.
The 737 MAX 8 was grounded worldwide after a similar deadly crash in March in Ethiopia.
Well, Anne Barker joins us now from Jakarta, and this is a damning report which made some 89 significant findings. Talk us through some of those issues uncovered.
Andrew, you're right. This is a litany of tragic errors and mishaps that caused this crash. The investigators in Indonesia make it clear that no one organisation or individual was responsible. It was a sad sort of complex chain of events. It says that the Lion Air ground staff, for example, should have grounded this plane the night before, because the days before there were several incidents like this happening. The flight from Bali to Jakarta just a day before, pilots had to deal with a similar problem with the anti-stall system, and only at the last minute were able to override it and continue that flight. They said that 31 pages from Lion Air's maintenance log from October were missing. You can only wonder what was in that and whether the knowledge of those contents might have helped ground staff make better decisions than they did. The faulty sensor, there's evidence that it was never tested properly before it was reinstalled in the plane. And in fact, it turns out that that sensor was 21 degrees out of alignment with the other sensor that was on the other side of the plane. Some of the complaints about Boeing, for example, with regards to the design of that MCAS system, is that the data that came to there was no warning device that showed that those two sensors were out of sync, for example. And it said that Boeing had wrongly assumed that the pilots knew what to do in such a situation. They absolutely didn't. They didn't have the right instructions, they didn't have the right manuals, and that was a big flaw for Boeing, that they need to redesign the system and make sure that there are better manuals in place.
And as you mentioned in your story, the report has failed to satisfy relatives of some of the victims.
That's right. The relatives are angry because the report isn't strong enough in sheeting home blame to perhaps the airline or Boeing. They want to see sanctions against Lion Air, for example. They want to see punishment recommended, but that was not the purpose of this report. They're also upset because they simply don't understand the technical side of it. They say the report has been written in technical lingo that doesn't really explain to the average person just what was at fault. But I think the problem there is that there were so many factors, as we've learnt. There is no one fault that they could understand. I mean, a lot of these families are suing Boeing in the courts in the US. Some people have already had payments of $1.2 million US. Some of the families here are still waiting for compensation, hoping for damages from either Lion Air or Boeing, and are hoping that that might bring them some justice.
And thanks very much. Our correspondent Anne Barker in Jakarta.